Hello, I'm Daniela, and welcome to part 2 of the Stitch With Me Barn Owl workshop. So in the first part, we selected materials, and I'll link that video below. We selected materials, we traced our sketch, we added the fabric to our slow stitching piece, the eyes, the beak, and the face. And then we started just with some basic stitching. Now all the stitches that I demonstrate are just the straight stitch, so it's a very simple stitch. But for your project, you can vary it however you'd like if you'd like to incorporate additional stitches or add more fabric or even less. In today's video, we're going to start stitching the head, framing the face, and creating something reminiscent of feathers on the body. So let's get started. So for the second day of our workshop, we're going to work on just creating a very light border here on the perimeter of the head and the shoulder area. So to do that, we're going to do the same stitch, just a little straight stitch that we did right around the heart-shaped face, but instead we're going to do it right around the border. And we want this to kind of resemble feathers. So for that, we want the angle of each of the stitches to be just slightly going down. And so I just draw this just as a little guide. And on the opposite side, we want them to be going down as well. Now, when you get to the top, in the center, we want them trying to make a V to replicate that V from the face, and then work their way out, and then gently and slowly start their slant. And for this reason, they start to resemble feathers and the direction that the feathers go. So I'm taking that same golden beige, and the color isn't important. It's the color that you want that coordinates or contrasts nicely with the fabric that you have. And then I'm going to start up top here, right at my sort of my midway point, and I'm just going to stitch that first stitch. So I come up from the back and I just make a short little stitch. Again, I'm following that direction, and I just skip a little spot and I'm adding another stitch. And these are just short little stitches that are creating that outer surface, that perimeter of the head and the body here. So I'm just making a few little stitches. I can make a few closer together, but I'm just really starting to make the guide here because we're going to fill this in with additional colors as we go. Now I can turn my piece and continue with these stitches and continuing with that direction, and that really makes a difference. It changes the stitches into something reminiscent of feathers. And I'll just continue this all the way down, just altering that angle ever so slightly. Now we're not making a formal outline. We're using the direction of these little stitches, and then with the quantity of them, it will appear as the outline to this bird here. So I just continue. Now, if you have a darker background, you might want to use a lighter thread so your body and your silhouette really shines through. It's really up to you. If you have a darker fabric or a bluer fabric, use a contrasting color or even a color that's just slightly darker. And this will help to really show your image. Now, as I get lower on the head, closer to the shoulders, my stitches are just going to elongate ever so slightly. And that's really indicative of the feathers that we'll see. You take this as far down as you want. You can go all the way down here to the edge. I think I'm just going to go right up here to approximately this point on either side. Now once I get to the bottom of my thread, if I still have more thread, I'll go back and just add a few more stitches going up the side of this face. Again, I'm not looking to create a pattern. I want some areas to have more of this color than others. It looks a little random that way, a little natural. Once I run out of thread, I'll knot my thread on the back. Now I'm going to thread my needle again with that same color, and I'll do the same process on this side. And then we'll come back and start filling in our outline. So I've completed that stitching on both sides just with that golden beige thread. And so now I have a nice border around my bird. This is a good time for me to go in there with my iron and just remove any of that marker that remains. So I'm just pressing it down so I can see what I have to work with underneath here. Now hopefully I'll see a nice border around the bird. It's certainly not complete, but it does give us more of an idea of what we have. So there we have a nice outline of our bird, and now we're going to work on filling it in. And we're going to start with this outline and we'll work our way in. So now I'm taking a beige thread, and this is very similar to the background thread, maybe just a little shade darker, but as you can see there's quite a bit of contrast between this and my golden beige that I chose. I like the light colors because this bird is a light bird with just some feathering, some discoloration for the feathering. So now I'm going to start at the top here with this thread, and I'm going to make stitches filling in some space in between the stitches I've already put down. So I'll go through that same procedure using this light color beige. And again, I want those stitches to be following that direction that we've already set down. And I can just come in here and fill that in all the way around. Now, if you use a different color than this beige, you want to just give some consideration. If it's too dark, it'll look like a formal outline. Right now, we're just trying to create shadows in the actual colors that we have, and that will trick the eye into thinking that there's an outline to that bird. So we're just going to go around adding stitches, sometimes 2, sometimes 1, sometimes 3, altering the spacing between them just for a more random look. By stitching in that direction with our stitches, we kind of give the impression of feathers. So this color, this beige, is going to be our most dominant color in our bird. It's going to be the most plentiful that we use because it's just a soft color, and it really makes the other colors next to it pop, but it gives us a little texture. And I'll just continue all the way down. I like to have all my stitches approximately the same length. The spacing I like to alter and make more random, but I like the length of the stitches to be approximately the same size. A few that are a little longer or shorter are just fine because that kind of shows the texture of the feathers. I just love the angle of these stitches and that color. So now it's really starting to fill in all the stitches here. I want it to be about 85% filled in, maybe a little higher, 85 to 90% filled in, so that I can only put in maybe a dozen or so stitches incorporating a different color when I'm done. So now I'm just going to use what I have left on my needle, going back up. I'll thread my needle again, and I'll come back down here as well, stitching that to really fill it in. All right, so now we finished all the way around here with our threads, and we're starting to really get some definition. I want to start by building up here in the center of the forehead, the top here. So what we're going to start is doing the same stitch, and we're going to use that original color that we used, that goldish beige. And what we want to do is kind of create an arc. So I'm just going to create those lines with my marker, and I'll just do a few of them. And now we're going to make stitches on those lines following that direction. So they're going to all be pointing in just like this. So we're starting to fill out our piece. I'm going to take my thread, knot it onto my needle, and I'm going to start right in the center here. And I'm leaving a little gap between the heart shape of the face and this area. We'll probably put in another layer, but for now I just want to create some stitches to look like little feathers. And I'm leaving a good 1/4 inch or so in between the feathers, the little stitches, and they're all going the same direction, and then they'll gradually change because we want to echo the rounded shape that's over here. So now I'm going to start making a little more of an angle. And just continue with that angle. And I'll do one more. And now I want to come up to the end of this row, a little past where I drew this guideline, and I want to make the stitches in the same direction as the row beneath it. I'll just do a few more over here. Again, making that space in between, keeping them at that angle. Then I'll go to the top here, and I'm going to make my stitches just a little bit smaller at the top of the head, still maintaining that little angle. And I'll do one more over here. Leaving a little space between the final stitch and the stitch of the outline. So now I want to just continue on the opposite side, pulling my stitches in the opposite direction. So I'll make one stitch that's just up and down, vertical, and then I'll just add a few more stitches going in the opposite direction, again to recreate that feathered look. We're starting to fill in the head of the bird. When I'm done there, I'll go to the next level, the next row, and start to add stitches again. Add a vertical one and then a few more to the side. If you need to stop and rethread your needle and add some more stitches, go ahead and do that. We'll rethread it in a few moments anyway because I'm running out of stitches. And if I see up here I could have used another stitch, I'll just add it right there now. Again, keeping a little distance between that edge. And then I'm going to add another row over here. Again, keeping that angle. Now I'm not really worried about getting them filled in just right yet. We'll add more as we go along. Right now I'm just trying to build up the different layers and the different colors of the thread. I'll add one more stitch going vertical. And then I'll knot my thread off on the back. So now I want to add another row. I'll use my marker just as a guide, and I want this row to go a little bit over to the edge here on both sides, right over here over that face mask. So now I'm going to put in another row of stitches using that gold thread. So I'm going to start right in the center, making that vertical stitch. And this just helps me to really just make it somewhat symmetrical. I don't want it to go perfectly symmetrical, but I want there to be that evenness to it, that balance. And then I'm just going to go starting towards the left side and just angle my stitches ever so slightly towards the left. And I'm going to leave a good space between stitches because on the way back I'll fill in that space. Again, I'm leaving a good distance between my stitch and the mask, as well as my stitches and the other stitches above it, the other row of stitches. I get towards the end, I'm going to have just more of an angle. Again, I want this to look like the feathers. So they'll follow those directions of those feathers that we have. And now I'll just work my way back towards the center, filling in spots in between stitches. I'm not looking for it to be as full as, say, the border was with stitches. I'm just trying to create a little bit of shadow with this golden beige thread. Again, I want that randomness to come out. And we're going to use other colors of thread to enhance it. So now I'll finish up by doing my stitches on this other side of the row, and then we'll come back and add a few more colors for dimension. So now I just want to remove the marker here. So I'm taking my hot iron and I just want to remove the marker because I find it a little distracting. Sometimes it's hard to see where my stitches are versus the marker. So now that I have that done, I can see that I'm starting to get the head of the bird. I'm going to come in there with my medium brown and I want to stitch some stitches here. And I want it to be pretty much centered in the top center of the head. I don't want it to be very dark, so I'm not going to do a lot of stitches. I'm going to start at the line right up top here, this little line we made, and maybe add 2 or 3 stitches. These are going to be just slightly bit smaller than the stitches we've already added in this section because this color is darker. And I just want there to be a little bit of variance and a little shadow, but not a lot of competition between the stitches. So I have a couple stitches here. I'll do one more at the end. And then I'm going to jump to the next row. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to increase the length of my stitch just a little bit because it's a larger row. But I'm going to maintain the direction of my stitches that they took. So I'm just going to add this right in. And I'm going to increase the amount of stitches that I add, probably doubling the amount that I used on that top row. We have more surface area to cover, but I also want it to look different. I want there to be a variation between those rows. The addition of the darker color will make it a little heavier as well. And I'll add a few more stitches on the side here. and maybe one more out here. And now I can start on my next row. Start right at the edge, increase the length of my stitch just a little bit, and add even more stitches. As I get closer to the center, I want them to be more congested. So instead of skipping stitches, I'll start to add them, maybe 2 at a time even. Again, I'm trying to maintain that flow and that shape of the rows. Continue. And now as I'm getting to the outer side, I'm going to skip a few spots and just add a stitch or 2 in there. I want to add a few stitches on this bottom row, but not as many as on the row above it. I do want the majority of them in the center though. And then once I have that row done, I'll stop and take a look at my stitching so far. So there I have the beginnings of the bird coming together. I want to continue with this. I can see that I've missed a few spots over here. It's just pretty light. So I'm going to rethread my needle with that medium brown, and we're going to actually start working on the outer edge here, incorporating a few little stitches of that medium brown. So taking my needle with the medium brown thread, I'm going to start at the base here, and I'm just going to add a stitch every so often. Again, I'm going to maintain that angle for the stitches, but I just want to create a little variation. So if there's room, I'll put a stitch, but I'll skip a number of stitches in the process. Now I go through a lot of thread this way because there's a lot of space where I'm not using stitches, but that's okay. I'm trying to create a little definition and a little interest to our piece. If there are some areas that have a lot of gap, you can add that extra stitch. The randomness of it makes it very attractive. And I'll just continue going around the perimeter here. Again, I'm not trying to keep them spaced evenly. I'm just trying to add a little pop of color. It's like we're painting with these threads. And as you can see, this is really starting to come to life. We haven't even started working on the facial features, but yet it is starting to have a little bit of a personality. So now when I'm at the top of the head, I'll continue my stitches with the angles that matches the existing stitches. And because it's darker thread, it really stands out. So your eye is drawn to these darker pieces. And if everything's in order, that the shapes and the stitches are facing the correct way, your eye just travels over them. But if they're facing the wrong direction, it's a little bit wonky and your eye gets caught there. So I'll just continue using all this thread, going the length of this bird as far as I can take it, before having to rethread my needle. I like to use this medium brown or any color that stands out from the existing colors as an accent piece. So we'll come back in after our piece is mostly done and add a few little dark brown stitches because it adds just a little bit of depth to our piece. So I've rethreaded my needle. I want to come back in here and add a few more stitches on the inside, the ones that I missed the first time around, but I noticed when I set down my work. So it's good to always go back and just assess what you've done. Once I have the stitches added the way I want them, I'll just continue down the length of this head. So with continuing to build up the outside in, I want to go in there with just my neutral thread here, and I want to fill in rows in between all of the rows we've already added. So I'm going to go right up top and make very little stitches at the top, the uppermost row. And I want those stitches to go in those same directions that we've been doing the entire time. Now I like to skip a lot of space between stitches. It uses up more thread, but it gives me more freedom to come across my piece, and then I can decide how much I really want to fill it in with stitches. Again, I like to leave a little space between that perimeter and that row. So I'm pretty happy with that row. I'm going to jump down to the next row and I'll fill all those stitches in. Again, I don't want my stitches to overlap. Just want to stitch in between the rows. And you can decide the density that you're achieving. You can have your stitches very close together. I like to have them kind of far apart because this way I see the texture of the stitches. They don't get lost up against each other. They don't look like a rug of stitches. They don't all just blend together. And I'll just continue working my way down and towards the center. If there's any areas that are too bare, I'll just come back in and add a stitch. And I'll continue this all the way around, using up all the thread, really focusing on this top area. Now this is a good time to just fill in the areas that you see as bare, and you can always go back in and fill additional ones later. I like to start by filling them in, seeing where I'm at, and then looking for any bare spots. So just remember not to overlap your stitches and to keep a little border between the perimeter and these rows of stitches that you're adding. And just fill in all the area on the top of the head. And we'll worry about the body in our next lesson. So there we have the bird, and we're starting to fill it in from the outside in. I'm going to take my thread, the same color, and I'm going to fill in all the way from the top here just down, just to the base around here. And then in our next lesson, we'll come back and finish up on the bottom of the body. So that concludes part 2 of this workshop. On Friday, I'll be back with a new video where we start to add colors to the feathers and start really outlining the face and adding a few little details. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe.